My name is Jeanette, and what I'm about to tell you happened in the winter of 2023. I needed to escape the chaos of the city, breathe some fresh air, and forget about my problems. I found the perfect cabin in the Colorado mountains, isolated, charming, surrounded by dense forests and a silence that seemed to touch my soul. The road to get there was winding and covered in snow, and as I climbed higher, the cell signal disappeared, along with any trace of civilization. When I finally arrived, the sun was already low on the horizon, painting the sky orange and purple. The cabin was small, dark wood, with a stone fireplace and windows looking out over the vast white mountains. Everything seemed perfect. After unloading the car and lighting the fire, I opened a bottle of wine and curled up in a blanket by the window. Outside, the wind made the bare branches of the trees sway, casting strange shadows on the snow. It was then that I noticed something. Farther back, where the forest began, there was a dark mark in the snow, an irregular stain that hadn't been there when I arrived. I frowned. Maybe it was just an optical illusion. But when I blinked and looked again, the stain had shifted. I tried to ignore that mark in the snow. Maybe it was just a play of shadows, or my mind playing tricks after a tiring day. I forced myself to look away, sank deeper into the sofa, and let the warmth from the fire surround me. The wood cracked as the flames grew, and for a while the sound was almost comforting. But then came another noise, a snap, dry and distant, like branches breaking. I frowned. It must be some animal, maybe a deer, a coyote, but then it came. Again, closer. Pause. Another snap. Something, or someone, was moving outside, stepping on the frozen snow. I sat up slowly and looked out the window, but all I saw was darkness between the trees. The forest was still. I waited a few seconds, holding my breath, but all I heard was the wind scraping against the cabin's walls. Maybe I was imagining things. Then just as I was about to lie down, I heard a different sound. Not a snap, but a dragging noise, as if something was sliding across the snow, slow, heavy. And then, out of nowhere, 3 knocks. Slow, precise, right on the cabin wall. The rest of the night passed in a state of uncomfortable vigilance. I sat there, wrapped in the blanket, listening to the wind and trying to convince myself that the knocks had just been a loose branch hitting the wood. Deep down, I knew they weren't, but I refused to go outside to check. I eventually fell asleep on the couch, and when I woke up, the first rays of sunlight were already coming through the window. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The fireplace still emitted faint embers, and the cabin was silent. It wasn't until I looked outside that my stomach sank. The snow around the cabin was marked. Footprints. They started at the edge of the forest and came right up to the wall where I had heard the knocks. But the worst part wasn't that. What made my heart race was the shape of them. They weren't regular footprints. They were huge, barefoot, and the toes were way too long, almost like claws. A chill ran down my spine. I stood there, frozen, in the doorway, looking at those marks that circled the cabin, as if something had spent the entire night walking around. And then I noticed something even stranger. There were no footprints leading back to the forest. I dressed quickly and drove to the nearest town. It was a small village with a few houses, a little grocery store, and a gas station. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I needed an explanation for those tracks. Maybe someone had seen something like that before. At the grocery store, while picking up an extra bundle of firewood, I mentioned the tracks in the snow to the cashier, an elderly man with a graying beard and a sharp gaze. The moment I said it, he stopped packing my bags and gave me a heavy look, not one of disbelief, but of recognition. "Are you staying at that cabin alone?" he asked, lowering his voice. When I confirmed, he took a deep breath and looked out the window, as if he expected to see something lurking outside. Then he told me about the stories from the area. For decades, hunters and locals had reported seeing something in the mountains. Something that walked on 2 legs but wasn't human. Strange footprints, shadows between the trees, and always the damned knocks on the window. "If you hear that again," he said, serious. Don't look. Don't open the curtain. Pretend you're not there, and most importantly, don't answer. Don't. The sky was already darkening when I returned to the cabin. The old man's words were still hammering in my head. If I hear knocks, don't look. Don't answer. I wanted to laugh at it, say it was just superstition, but something in the way he spoke, the empty look in his eyes, made me take it seriously. The wind was stronger that night, howling through the cracks in the wood. I lit the fireplace, locked the doors and windows, and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine. But then the snowstorm began. The gusts shook the walls of the cabin and the lights started flickering. First slowly, then faster, until suddenly they went out completely. The silence was almost immediate. No sound from the heater, no hum from the fridge, just the wind outside and the crackling of the embers in the fireplace. I grabbed my phone, but of course, no signal, no internet. I sat there in the dark, listening to the storm raging outside. And then, between gusts of wind, I heard it again. 3 knocks. Slow, spaced out. But this time, they weren't on the wall. They were on the window, less than 2 meters from where I was. My body froze. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, but I could barely hear it over the dull knock that still echoed against the wood of the window. 3 taps, precise, calculated, as if they knew I was there. My hands gripped the arms of the chair, and my breath became shallow, interrupted by panic. Everything inside me screamed to look, to peek through the corner of the curtain and end that unbearable uncertainty. But the old man's words kept ringing in my head. Don't look. Don't open the curtain. I stayed there, still, hoping it was just the wind or a branch tapping. But then came the second knock. This time, stronger. The wood trembled with the pact. My heart raced. I closed my eyes, praying for it to go away, for it to be just my imagination playing tricks. But then, under the faint light of the fireplace, I noticed something in the snow outside. A shadow cast on the ground. Tall, slender. I couldn't see what was creating it, but it was there, standing on the other side of the window. And slowly, the shadow began to move, sliding along the side of the cabin, heading toward the front door. Panic settled into my chest like a cold ice. I knew I shouldn't look, but the knocks and the shadow consumed me. My body reacted before my mind. Slowly, almost unwillingly, I got up from the chair and approached the window. I breathed deeply, my eyes fixed on the snow outside where that slender figure was now moving with a disturbing grace. Each step was like a macabre choreography. Suddenly, a low whisper, almost imperceptible, pierced the stillness of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It was a hoarse, distorted voice, as if it were trying to mimic human words. It dragged across, the glass between the wind's howl and the wood's creaks. It was impossible to understand, but the feeling that something was speaking to me was terrifying. My fingers gripped the curtain, hesitant, as if part of me wanted to understand, to see what was out there. But I knew, somehow, that it would only make things worse. At that moment, the doorknob made a sound, a dragging, faint noise, as if something were trying to turn it from the inside. My breath caught, and the silence settled again, heavy and oppressive, tightened by the feeling that I was no longer alone. I went to the table, where I saw the old journal hidden among piles of paper. I was drawn to it like a magnet. It was dusty, with worn covers, and part of the cover was torn. I carefully opened the pages, and soon the accounts began to take shape. The last inhabitant of the cabin, a hunter who had lived there many years before me, had recorded his experiences with that creature. His words were rushed as if he had written non-stop with an increasing urgency that showed in every line. He talked about nights filled with nightmares, the feeling of constantly being watched, and the knocks on the window. As the days passed, he became more paranoid, more isolated. What made me tremble the most was when he described the same shadow I had seen, but with a detail that made me freeze. He saw it reflected in the windows, as if it were an extension of what was outside, but also inside. When I got to the last page, the scribbles became more frantic. He described the creature with words that made me tense up. He saw me, now he won't stop. The last sentence was smudged, as if he had written it in a hurry. But there was something even stranger. It seemed like he was warning someone. I closed the journal with a feeling of anguish tightening my chest. The hunter's words echoed in my mind as I rummaged through the rest of the drawer. At the bottom, I found an old yellowed photograph. The image showed a group of men, hunters, probably, smiling and posing together, rifles over their shoulders in what looked like a snow expedition. But what froze me was the background of the photograph. Among the trees, partially hidden, there was a dark silhouette that shouldn't have been there. It was tall, with an odd posture, almost human, but its shape didn't fit. Its limbs seemed disproportionately long, as if it were something that didn't belong in this world. The feeling of being watched returned with force, stronger than ever. I looked back at the window, expecting to see the shadow's figure creeping through the forest, but there was nothing. Only the silence and the snow gently falling. The problem was, every time I looked at the photo, the silhouette seemed sharper, more present. That face, or what I assumed was a face, seemed to be staring directly at me, as if it knew I was there. The urgency to understand what was happening here only grew. I needed to know more, to discover more about this place before it was too late. The tension was palpable, as if the cabin itself was caught between two realities. The photo and the journal weighed on me, but what really made me stop was the reflection in the window. I looked without meaning to, impulsively, as if some invisible force were pulling me in. The shadow was there, outside, exactly where I had seen it before. But something was different. It wasn't just moving across the snow anymore. Now, it was standing still, with its head tilted, as if studying me. The air grew heavy, and I knew I shouldn't have looked. The reflection seemed distorted, as if the figure wasn't entirely physical, something more ethereal. I tried to pull away from the window, but a strange impulse made me keep looking. The details were sharper now. Its long, thin legs, the arms that stretched almost to the ground. And then, as if it had sensed I was watching, the figure took a step toward the cabin. The shadow moved with supernatural speed, faster than any human could. The reflection then distorted even more, and that's when the front door, out of nowhere, started to move. The doorknob turned slowly, with a low, chilling noise. I ran to the door, trying to stop it from opening, but it was too late. When the doorknob turned all the way, the door opened by itself and the figure was there, in the darkness. Its eyes glowed, a strange, cold light that seemed to pierce my soul. A whisper, soft like the wind, formed into words. You looked. And then, before I could scream, everything around me collapsed into silence. The cabin, the forest, the shadow. Everything disappeared. When I woke up, I was on the road. The car stopped, and snow was falling all around me. But I knew. That was real. It wasn't just in my head.